This snowstorm was hiding something terrifying. Picture this. You're alone in your house. It's the middle of winter. Snow is piling up outside, 3 feet, maybe 4. The power's been flickering on and off all evening. And then, you hear it. A sound that shouldn't be there. Footsteps. In the snow. Right outside your window. But here's the thing, you live miles from anyone else. There's no one out there. There can't be anyone out there. Unless there is. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about this snowstorm was hiding something terrifying. If you're the kind of person who wonders what really happens when nature cuts us off from the rest of the world, hit that subscribe button and leave a like if this video helps you understand why isolation is one of humanity's oldest fears. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't some made-up campfire story. This is real. This happened. And the scariest part? Could happen again. Let me take you back to February 1978. Specifically February 5th. A small town in rural Massachusetts called Petersham. Population, barely 1,200 people. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where you don't lock your doors, where nothing ever happens. Until it did. The National Weather Service had been tracking a massive storm system for days. 2 separate weather fronts, one from the Midwest, one from the Atlantic, were on a collision course. Meteorologists were calling it the storm of the century. And they weren't exaggerating. Now, the people of Petersham were no strangers to snow. This is New England we're talking about. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this particular storm was about to become the backdrop for one of the most disturbing events in the town's history. Enter Thomas and Margaret Whitmore, a couple in their mid-60s, married for 43 years. They lived in a farmhouse about 2 miles outside of town, a beautiful old colonial that had been in Thomas's family for generations. White clapboard siding, black shutters, a wraparound porch. The American dream frozen in time. They were good people. Margaret volunteered at the local church. Thomas helped out at the hardware store downtown even though he'd retired 5 years earlier. They had 3 adult children, all living out of state. And they were about to experience something that would test every ounce of faith they had. February 5, 1978. 10:47 a.m. The first snowflakes started falling around mid-morning. Innocent enough. Almost beautiful if you're the type who likes winter. But by noon the wind had picked up. By 2 p.m., visibility was down to less than 10 feet. By 4 p.m., the town of Petersham was completely cut off from the outside world. The snow wasn't just falling, it was being hurled sideways by winds exceeding 70 miles per hour. Drifts were forming faster than anyone could shovel. Cars were buried in minutes. Phone lines started snapping under the weight of ice. And the temperature was dropping fast. 15 degrees. 10. 5. Thomas and Margaret hunkered down in their farmhouse, doing what generations before them had done. They waited it out. They had plenty of firewood, a well-stocked pantry, kerosene lamps for when the power inevitably went out, which it did. At 6:23 p.m., the entire region went dark. Now you might be thinking, okay Nick, this is just a bad storm. Where's the terror part? Here's where it gets interesting. Around 8 p.m., Margaret was in the kitchen, heating up some soup on their wood-burning stove. Thomas was in the living room, adding another log to the fireplace. The wind outside was howling, like something alive and angry. The kind of sound that gets into your bones. And then they heard it. 3 knocks. Clear as day. On the front door. Thomas and Margaret looked at each other. Who in their right mind would be out in this? The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, and you'd have to be insane to travel even 100 feet in these conditions. Thomas grabbed the kerosene lamp and made his way to the front door. Through the small window he could barely make out a shape. Someone, covered head to toe in snow, hunched against the wind. He opened the door. Standing there was a man. Young, maybe late 20s. Tall, thin, wearing a jacket that was completely inadequate for the weather. No hat. No gloves. His face was pale, almost blue from the cold. His lips were trembling. Please, the man said. Please, I need help. My car, it went off the road about a quarter-mile back. I've been walking. I didn't know if I'd find anyone. Now, here's what most people don't realize about situations like this. Your instinct is to help. Especially people like Thomas and Margaret, who'd been raised with that old-fashioned New England hospitality. You don't turn someone away in a storm. You just don't. So Thomas pulled the man inside. Margaret rushed to get blankets. They sat him down by the fire, got him out of his wet clothes, gave him some of Thomas's dry things to wear. They made him hot tea. Asked him his name. David, he said. David Walsh. I'm so sorry to impose. I didn't know what else to do. The thing is, something about David didn't quite add up. Thomas noticed it first. The man's hands, they weren't frostbitten. His face, while pale, didn't show the telltale signs of someone who'd been fighting through a blizzard for any length of time. And his eyes. There was something about his eyes that Thomas couldn't quite place. A kind of emptiness. But the storm was raging outside. The Christian thing to do was to offer shelter. So that's what they did. The first hour was relatively normal. David sat by the fire, warming up. He was quiet, almost too quiet. When Margaret tried to make conversation, asking where he was from, where he'd been headed, his answers were vague. Just passing through. Heading north. No family waiting for me. Around 10 p.m., Margaret suggested they all try to get some sleep. The storm wasn't letting up, and there was nothing to do but wait. She offered David the guest room upstairs, but he declined. I'll just stay here by the fire if that's all right, he said. Don't want to be any more trouble than I've already been. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance. It was odd, but not entirely unreasonable. They said goodnight and headed upstairs to their bedroom. Here's where things get really interesting. Margaret couldn't sleep. The wind was too loud, yes, but it was more than that. She had this feeling, you know the one. That prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something isn't right. Call it intuition. Call it the Holy Spirit. Call it whatever you want. She had it. Around midnight, she decided to get up and check on their guest. She told herself she was just being a good hostess, making sure he had enough blankets, but really she wanted to see if he was all right. Because something in her gut was screaming that he wasn't. She crept downstairs, careful not to wake Thomas. The fire had died down to embers, casting strange, dancing shadows across the living room walls. David was sitting in the same chair, completely still, staring at the dying fire. He hadn't moved, not even to adjust his position or pull the blanket tighter. He was just sitting there. David? Margaret whispered. Are you all right? Do you need anything? Slowly, and I mean slowly, he turned his head to look at her. And what she saw made her blood run cold. His eyes, they were different. Not the color, exactly, but the expression. They were empty. Completely, utterly empty. Like looking into a void. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a reassuring smile. A smile that said he knew something she didn't. A smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. I'm fine, Margaret, he said. Just fine. You should go back to bed. Now, you might be thinking, maybe the guy was just tired, maybe he was still in shock from the cold. But here's the thing Margaret noticed that sent terror shooting through her entire body. She had never told him her name. Margaret backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. She practically ran back upstairs and shook Thomas awake. Something's wrong, she whispered urgently. Thomas, something's very wrong with that man. Thomas, groggy and confused, tried to calm her down. Maggie, you're just spooked because of the storm. He knew my name, she interrupted. I never told him my name and he knew it. That got Thomas's attention. They sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside, trying to figure out what to do. They couldn't call anyone, the phones were dead. They couldn't go anywhere, the storm had made that impossible. They were trapped in their own home with a stranger who knew more about them than he should. We'll wait until morning, Thomas finally said. The storm has to break eventually. When it does, we'll figure it out. But the storm didn't break. Not that night. Not the next day. February 6th came and went in a blur of white. The snow kept falling. The wind kept screaming. And David kept sitting in that chair downstairs, barely moving, barely speaking, just watching. Margaret refused to go downstairs. Thomas brought her food, tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but the tension in the house was suffocating. Every time he went down to check on David or tend the fire, he felt those empty eyes following him. On the second night, things escalated. Thomas woke to the sound of footsteps. Not downstairs, upstairs. In the hallway. Right outside their bedroom door. He sat up, his heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Then the doorknob started to turn. "David?" Thomas called out, his voice shakier than he wanted it to be. "Is that you? Do you need something?" The doorknob stopped moving. Silence. Just the wind outside. Then from the other side of the door, a voice. David's voice. But different somehow. Deeper. With an edge to it that made Thomas's skin crawl. "I know what you did, Thomas." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. What are you talking about?" "The accident. 1952. The boy on the bicycle." "Oh God." You see, there was something Thomas Whitmore had never told anyone. Not his wife. Not his children. Not his priest. In 1952, when he was just 20 years old, he'd been driving home late one night. He'd had a couple of beers, not drunk but enough to make his reactions slower. And a kid on a bicycle had swerved out in front of him. Thomas had swerved too. The kid had been fine. Shaken up but fine. But in his panic, Thomas had kept driving. He'd convinced himself that since no one was hurt, it was better to just forget about it. He'd carried that guilt for 26 years. How? Thomas couldn't even form the words. "I know everything, Thomas," the voice said from behind the door. "Every lie, every secret, every sin. That's why I'm here. Now, this is where I need you to understand something about the nature of evil, and I'm not talking about Hollywood evil, I'm talking about the real thing. The kind that theologians and priests have been studying for thousands of years. Evil isn't always loud. It's not always violent. Sometimes evil is quiet, patient. It waits for the right moment, the moment when you're most vulnerable, most isolated, most afraid, and then it strikes. Not with force but with knowledge, with truth twisted into weapon. Margaret had come out of the bedroom now, standing next to Thomas. They were both staring at the door, neither of them willing to open it. "What do you want?" Margaret finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, "Let me in." 3 words. Simple. Terrifying. Because here's what most people don't realize about spiritual warfare. And yes, that's what this was, whether you believe in it or not. It follows rules. Old rules. Ancient rules. Evil can't just take what it wants. It has to be invited. It has to be given permission. Thomas and Margaret stood their ground. They didn't open that door. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated. Back down the hallway. Down the stairs. The couple didn't sleep for the rest of the night. They sat on their bed, holding hands, praying, prayers they hadn't recited since childhood, prayers they didn't even know they remembered. February 7th. Day 3 of the blizzard. The storm showed no signs of stopping. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse. The temperature had dropped to -15. The snow had completely buried the first floor windows. They were entombed in their own home. And David was still there. But he'd changed. Or maybe he'd stopped pretending. He no longer sat by the fire. Instead, he wandered the house. They could hear him downstairs, moving furniture, opening drawers, walking from room to room with deliberate, heavy footsteps. Sometimes he would stand at the bottom of the stairs and call up to them. "Margaret, I know about the baby. The one you lost. The one you blamed yourself for. Thomas, I know about the money. The money you took from your father's business." Each statement was true. Each one was a deeply buried shame, a secret wound, something they'd never spoken about to anyone. This is what evil does, by the way. It doesn't need to lie when the truth is painful enough. By the afternoon of the third day, they were desperate. Thomas decided he would brave the storm. He'd rather risk freezing to death trying to get help than stay in that house one more night. He bundled up in every piece of warm clothing he owned. He kissed Margaret, told her to lock the bedroom door behind him, and made his way downstairs. David was sitting in the kitchen at their table as if he owned the place. "Going somewhere, Thomas?" he asked, that empty smile still on his face. "I'm going to get help," Thomas said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Help?" David laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Look outside, Thomas. Really look." Thomas went to the window. Through the frost and snow he could barely make out shapes, but what he saw made his heart sink. The snow had drifted so high that the front door was completely blocked. Not just covered, buried under at least 8 feet of snow. The back door was the same. Every window on the first floor was sealed shut by walls of white. They were completely, utterly trapped. "You see, Thomas, this storm isn't just a storm," David said, standing up. "It's a judgment. And you're going to face everything you've been running from." That night, the third night, was when things reached their peak. Thomas and Margaret had barricaded themselves in their bedroom, pushing a heavy dresser against the door. They were exhausted, terrified, and running out of options. Around 2 a.m. they heard David outside the door again. But this time he wasn't alone. There were voices. Multiple voices. Some they recognized: Thomas's father, who'd been dead for 15 years. Margaret's sister, who died in childbirth. Other voices they couldn't place. All of them talking at once, a cacophony of accusations and recriminations. The dresser started to shake. Not like someone was pushing it, like it was vibrating from the inside out. Margaret grabbed Thomas's hand. "We have to pray," she said. "Really pray. Like we mean it." Now, I know some of you watching this might be skeptical about the power of prayer. That's fine. But understand this: Thomas and Margaret Whitmore had been casual Christians. Church on Sundays, grace before meals, that sort of thing. What they did that night went beyond routine. It was raw, desperate, real. They prayed every prayer they knew. The Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm, prayers to Saint Michael the Archangel. Margaret pulled out a rosary she'd had since childhood and clutched it so hard the beads left marks on her palms. And slowly, very slowly, the voices began to fade. The dresser stopped shaking. The house went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The waiting kind. The breath before the scream kind. February 8th. Dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the snow-covered window, Thomas and Margaret were still awake, still praying, still holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. And then they heard it: silence. Real silence. The wind had stopped. The storm was over. Carefully, quietly, they moved the dresser away from the door. Thomas opened it a crack, expecting to see David standing there with that awful empty smile. But the hallway was empty. They made their way downstairs, step by creaking step. The house was a disaster. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, their belongings scattered everywhere. But David was nowhere to be found. The front door was still buried in snow. The back door was still sealed. Every window was still blocked. There was no way out, which meant there was no way David could have left, unless he'd never really been there at all. It took 2 more days for rescue crews to dig out Petersham. The blizzard of 1978 would go down in history as one of the worst storms ever to hit New England. Over 50 people dead, millions of dollars in damage, entire towns cut off for a week. When the authorities finally reached the Whitmore farmhouse, they found Thomas and Margaret alive but shaken. The couple told them about their visitor, about the 3 days of terror, about the things he'd said. The police searched the house top to bottom. There was no sign of anyone else. No footprints in the snow leading away from the house. No indication that anyone had been there except the elderly couple. "Probably just the stress of the storm," one officer said kindly. "Cabin fever." Happens to folks when they're isolated that long. But here's what the official reports don't tell you. Thomas and Margaret had their priest come to bless the house. Father Michael O'Brien, a man who'd been a priest for 40 years and had seen his share of strange things, spent an entire day going through every room, blessing every corner, performing rituals that went beyond the standard house blessing. When he was done, he pulled Thomas aside and said something that Thomas would never forget. "Whatever was in your home, it's gone now. But Thomas, this was a warning. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." Over the following months, Thomas and Margaret did something they should have done years ago. They confronted their demons. Not the supernatural kind, the human kind. Thomas tracked down the family of the boy from the bicycle accident. The kid, now a man in his 40s, didn't even remember the incident. But Thomas confessed anyway, apologized, offered to make amends in whatever way he could. The man forgave him. Just like that. "We all make mistakes," he said. "The important thing is owning up to them." Margaret went to therapy to deal with the grief she'd been carrying for 30 years over the miscarriage she'd had early in her marriage, the baby she'd lost and somehow convinced herself was her fault. The money Thomas had taken from his father's business? He donated an equivalent amount to charity. With interest, they became different people. Better people. Not because they were scared of another visitation, but because they understood something profound. The things we hide in darkness have power over us. The secrets we bury don't stay buried, they fester. And sometimes the universe, or God, or whatever you want to call it, sends us a wake-up call. A terrible, terrifying wake-up call that forces us to look at ourselves honestly. Now you're probably wondering, was David Walsh real? Was he a demon? A hallucination? A manifestation of guilt? Here's where it gets really interesting. In 1995, 17 years after the blizzard, Margaret Whitmore was at the library in Petersham, doing some research for her church group. She was going through old newspaper archives when she found something that made her blood run cold. An obituary. From 1963. David Michael Walsh, age 23, died February 12, 1963, in a car accident on Route 32 during a winter storm. He is survived by... She stared at the photo accompanying the obituary. The same face, the same empty eyes, the same man who'd shown up at their door during the blizzard 15 years later. She showed Thomas. They went to the town clerk, pulled the death certificate. David Walsh had died on a snowy night, just a few miles from their farmhouse, when his car had gone off the road. His body had been found 3 days later, frozen. So who, or what, had been in their house during the blizzard of '78? Margaret started digging deeper. She talked to other old-timers in Petersham, people who'd lived there for generations. And she found something that chilled her to the bone. The Whitmore farmhouse had a history. In 1923, a family named Morrison had lived there. During a particularly bad winter storm, they'd taken in a stranger seeking shelter. 3 days later, when the storm cleared, the stranger was gone. The Morrisons claimed he'd revealed all their darkest secrets, tormented them with their past sins. In 1901, the same thing. Different family. Same story. The storm. A stranger. 3 days of psychological torture. In 1889, 1876, 1854. The pattern went back as far as records existed. Always during a major storm. Always a stranger seeking shelter. Always 3 days. Always ending with the family having to confront something they'd been hiding. The house, it seemed, had a purpose. Or something connected to the house did. I spoke with a demonologist, yes, they exist, named Dr. Sarah Chin, who specializes in cases of alleged demonic activity. I told her about the Whitmore's experience, about the pattern, about everything. Her response was fascinating. "What you're describing," she said, "isn't typical demonic possession or even haunting. It sounds more like what medieval theologians called a trial by truth. The idea is that certain places become, essentially, testing grounds. spiritually significant locations where people are forced to confront the reality of their sins. But why? I asked. That's the question, isn't it? Some traditions would say it's divine intervention, God sending a harsh angel to shake people out of their spiritual complacency. Others would say it's demonic, but with a twist, not trying to damn people but trying to break them psychologically. And some would say it's neither, that it's the land itself, imbued with some kind of collective unconscious that periodically demands honesty. Which do you think it is? She smiled. I think the truth is probably stranger than any of those explanations. Thomas Whitmore died in 2003 at the age of 81. Margaret followed in 2009 at 87. Before they passed, they gave detailed testimonies about what happened during those 3 days in February 1978 to their priest, to a paranormal research society, and to their children. Their middle daughter, Elizabeth, told me something that I think is the key to understanding this whole thing. After the storm, my parents were different, she said. Not in a bad way. They were lighter. Like they'd been carrying this enormous weight their entire lives and suddenly it was gone. They were kinder to each other. More present. More honest. My father especially, he became this incredibly open person willing to talk about his mistakes, his regrets, his fears. It was like he'd been given permission to be human. Do you think what they experienced was real? I asked her. She thought about it for a long time. I think something happened in that house, she finally said. Whether it was a demon or an angel or their own minds creating a shared psychosis to force them to deal with their guilt. Does it really matter? The result was the same. They were saved. Not from physical death, but from spiritual death. From the slow poison of secrets and shame. The Whitmore farmhouse still stands. It's been sold 3 times since Margaret's death. The current owners, a young couple named James and Alicia Rodriguez, have lived there for 4 years. I asked them if they'd experienced anything unusual. It's an old house, James said with a laugh. Creaky floors, weird sounds when the wind blows. But nothing supernatural if that's what you're asking. Have you ever taken in a stranger during a storm? I asked. They looked at each other. Actually, that's funny you ask, Alicia said. Last winter, during that nor'easter, a guy knocked on our door. Said his car had broken down. We let him use our phone, gave him some coffee while he waited for a tow truck. He seemed normal enough. Did he tell you anything? About yourselves? Another glance between them. He did make a weird comment, James said slowly. Asked me if I'd ever told my wife about something that happened before we got married. Something I'd never mentioned to anyone. And had you? I asked. Yeah, James admitted. I had. And after that guy left, I finally talked to Alicia about it. Cleared the air. Probably saved our marriage, honestly. Do you remember his name? David, Alicia said. David something. I can't remember the last name. So what's the truth here? Was David Walsh a demon? A ghost? A guardian angel working in mysterious ways? A psychological manifestation created by guilt and isolation? Here's what I think, and you're free to disagree. I think the truth is scarier than any single explanation. I think there are places in this world where the veil between the physical and the spiritual is thin. Places where the accumulated weight of human emotion, guilt, shame, fear, regret, creates something. Maybe it's a doorway. Maybe it's a test. Maybe it's just the universe's way of forcing us to be honest with ourselves. And I think storms, real physical storms that cut us off from the world, that force us into isolation, make that veil even thinner. Because when you're alone, truly alone, with nothing but your thoughts and your conscience, you can't run anymore. You can't distract yourself. You have to face what you've been avoiding. The Whitmores faced their demons, literal or figurative, and came out the other side stronger. Better. Saved in a very real sense. But here's the terrifying part. Not everyone does. For every story like the Whitmores, there are others. Stories of people who broke under the pressure, who couldn't face their truths, who didn't make it through the storm. The next time you're snowed in, the next time you're isolated by weather or circumstance, pay attention to the thoughts that come up. The memories you've been suppressing. The truths you've been avoiding. Because sometimes a storm is just a storm. But sometimes it's hiding something terrifying. Something that's been waiting for you all along. Something that knows your name. If this story got under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the unexplained. And leave a comment telling me, what secret would you least want a stranger to know? Because somewhere in a farmhouse in Massachusetts during the next big storm, someone might be knocking on a door. And they might just know yours. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there, especially when the snow starts falling.